This is Gemara and Beitzah Daf Chof Dalit. All the learning for this month, the month of Tishrei, has been generously sponsored as a chosr for Shleima ben Yutam Mirz Hashem. He should have a continued recovery as well as all the learning for this week. The week of Sukkot has been sponsored as Zechar Nishmas as Zahava Bas David Alevi, whose yard say was on Zion Tishrei. The learning of the Derech Habura should be a tremendous chos Ili Nishmasa, as well as all our Chilim and Menu Vega Shlomo Yos ben Eniyavida Chaim ben Tzar Shlom Zin Rezel Sar Bas Kanandi the Basim V'Chai Sara. Yosef Yobam Mendeler Spread the Shalei Shamaz Navi which Avigu Shevchan Shmom and Tiladin V'Chan Rizom Chaim Asile Rachav Tavamusa Adin Eina Basin Minas Vivi Grod Mechalesem Mesalur V'Kov Hashem Naftalzim Mechalester B'Sai Sharchali Yisrael Zos Chashich V'Shachaim and Devaira and Shiri Miriam Bas Rezel Gittel. We begin a new parak, the third parak here in Mesechus Beitzah on the Chol HaMoed Sukkot. Says the Mishnah, Ein tzadim dagin min habibarim v'yamtif. You're not allowed to trap fish from fish ponds and yantif. And now we're actually moving along in the food preparation processes. We've been discussing the cooking, the davar hashav l'chol nefesh. What is allowed on yantif? We continue that not only the cooking, but other items like mugmar, like this incense. It's something which is a shav l'chol nefesh, perhaps. That was yesterday's daf. And today says the Mishnah, what about trapping the animals in order to cook them on yantif? So says the Mishnah, Ein tzadim dagim mi bibarim mi yantif. You're not allowed to trap fish from fish ponds in yantif. Ve'inosav name is zaynos. You're not allowed to place food in front of them. Aval tzadim chayiv oif min bibarim. But you're allowed to trap chayos, wild animals, oif, are birds, min habibarim, from their enclosure. So this word biber, originally we translated as pond, and now we're translated as an enclosure. The enclosure, the area that in houses that traps, that keeps these animals. So again, you're allowed to catch. Let's just get something clear. Sometimes you're going to be trapping something into an enclosure, and then sometimes you can be trapping something from an enclosure. Very different, obviously. If my chaya or my oif, my wild animal or my fowl is sitting in a beaver, in an enclosure, to trap it from the enclosure is obviously one level. Another level is going to be trapping it and putting it into the enclosure. That's going to be the two levels. So the Mishnah says trapping from the bibarim. The nice name is Zaynes, and you're allowed to, yes, put food in front of them. Rashba Goimer says of Shimon Gamliel, Lo Kalai Bibur and Shavel. Not everything is equal. Zak Klal says of Shimon Gamliel. This is the rule as we turn over to today's daf. Chav Daled Amad Aleph. Kol Am Bechusar Seida. Aser. If something is lacking in trapping, it's not considered a trap yet. Aser, it's forbidden to trap it, as one could anticipate, because trapping is forbidden. If it's not lacking in trapping, it's allowed. So first of all, we're seeing this Mishnah is that even though cooking for yantif is allowed, but trapping is not allowed. Perhaps if something is already considered a trap, you're allowed to further trap it, but to trap something, let's say from the wild, everyone would agree is not allowed. What's the reason? The simple reason is because, as we mentioned, only that which cannot be done prior to Yantif is allowed to be done on Yantif. Trapping an animal, of course, is something that could have been done prior to Yantif, and therefore we're not allowed to do it on Yantif itself. But the Gemara now begins by going and honing in on this Chaya and Oif that we spoke about in the Mishnah. Ask the Gemara, will ask you a contradiction. Bibarim shal Chaya v'shal Oif is ein sadim and Yantif. If I have an enclosure of a Chaya, a wild animal, an Oif of a bird, says the Beitzah, ein sadim mehem. You're not allowed to trap from that enclosure on Yantif. The ain't nice name is nice, and you're not allowed to put food in front of them. So our Mishnah said, when the wild animal, when the fowl is in the enclosure, you're allowed to trap it. Here it says clearly, you are not allowed to trap it. Says the Gemara, kasha chaya chaya, kasha oif oif. We have a double contradiction. Both cases of chaya and oif are inherent contradictions. Answers the Gemara. Bishlama, if you want, you can tell me. It makes a lot of sense. Chaya chaya loy kasha. The contradiction within the wild animals is not a problem. Why not? Harav Yehuda Rabbanan. There are two opinions with regard to trapping a wild animal from an enclosure. Again, we cannot emphasize enough. The case we're discussing is wild animals inside a corral, and you're taking it from there, and that is where we have a debate, allowed or not allowed. One Rav Yehuda, one Rabbanan. Titanan, as we learned today, Mishnah. Rav Yehuda, if you trap a bird from a migdal, from a tower, utzvi, or a deer labayis, I read that incorrectly. You trap a bird limigdal into the tower. That's what I was pointing out. I made the mistake myself. You trap the bird by putting it into its tower, its closet. Utzvi, you put the deer labayis. You trap a deer into your house. Says the Beitzah of Yudah holds chayiv. Says Rav Yehuda, you're only obligated if you put it in your house. You're not obligated if you put it in your enclosure, which, by the way, we can see both sides of the coin. The same way, you're not obligated for putting the animal into the enclosure. What must be the reason? Because it's not considered trapped in that area. Taking a deer and putting it in the house, you didn't trap the deer, because the deer is still going to run around. So it says Rav Yehuda, it's not considered trapped in that area. That I said that incorrectly. One more time. Apologies. Having a rough day here. Again, tzvi lebayis chayiv, lebayis to the machayiv. You're not allowed to put it into the house. You're chayiv for trapping it in the house. Perhaps that's the way I said it the first time. I'm sorry. Aval bibarim, you're allowed to put it. It's not chayiv. You're allowed to put it into the closure because it's not considered trapped from there. And of course, that's not like our Mishnah. Because as Rashi over here so eloquently points out, Rashi says the Beitzah is Rav Yehuda. The Beitzah that said you're not allowed to trap from the enclosure. What must be the reason? That the animal is not considered trapped in the enclosure. It's like it's wild. So to trap from there is a problem. Whereas our Mishnah that says you're allowed to trap from the enclosure, what must the reason be? It's already considered trapped in that enclosure. And by token, you also would not be allowed to put in to that enclosure. I'm sorry for repeating a dead horse. Pardon the bad pun. So that's going to be the machlaikas, that according to the Chachamim, putting something into a biber, putting the chayo, the wild animal, into this enclosure is considered trapping. And by extension, if it's already in the enclosure, you would, yes, be allowed to take it out of there. Of course, it's the exact opposite. To put it in is going to be a problem because it's called trapping. Once it's there, take it from there is not a problem because it's already trapped. That's our Mishnah. Whereas the Beitzah says, Rabbi Yehuda, so we answered up the contradiction within chayo. Elo oifas haoifas kasha, but says the Gemara, the contradiction within birds. What are you going to tell me? Perhaps you'll suggest. Hanabiloi kasha, it's not a problem. Habibir mikura, habibir shena mikura. One Beitzah is talking about where it has a roof. That's when it's called trapped. One Beitzah, when it doesn't have a roof, that's when it's not called trap. Says the Gemara, you can't say that. Vabai it could be mikura dami. A house is a place, obviously, that has a roof. And yet, in the Rav Yehuda, in the Rabbanan, tzibur lemigdal in labayis loy, they both are going to agree that tzibur, the bird, you're allowed to trap into the migdal, into the closet. However, labayis loy, that it's considered trapped. I shouldn't say you're allowed to. I said it wrong again. It's considered trapped into the closet. It's not considered trapped into the bayis. Both Rav Yehuda and the Chacham agree with that. So how are we going to answer up the contradiction within the oif? It says the Gemara, teretz number 1, Amar Rabba Rav Huna, what's the case? Beitzah durar askinon. Deal with a durar bird, a wild bird, she'einai mikabelis maros, that does not accept a master upon it. As Rashi explains, regardless, it's never going to be trapped, even in an enclosed area. It's not called enclosed, it's always going to run around wild. As we see, the durar, where does that word come from? She'dara, durar, from the word dara, it lives. That lives in a house like the field. Meaning just like in the field, it roams free, even in the house, which is a chiddush. Obviously, even in an enclosed area, roams free, like Rashi says. It goes from corner to corner and finds places to hide. Says the Gemara, great, but hashadas la'achi. Now that Rabbi Rav Huna came along to answer up, we're talking about this special type of bird that is wild everywhere. We could say the same thing by the chayo, by the wild animals. I would be rukad and I would be bergadol. There are different types of beavers, different types of an enclosure. When it's a small animal, then when it's trapped in a small enclosure, you could take it from there. When it's trapped in a large enclosure, you cannot take it from there. The Gemara explains, what is small, what is large? Obviously, those words are subjective. Explains the Gemara, explains Rav Ashi, if you could run after the animal, and with one leap, you could grab it, Bieber cotton. That's called a small enclosure. That means the animal's already trapped. To give a simple example, a mouse in a little room might be difficult to catch, even if it's in a little room. Meaning, so that's called it. You cannot get it b'chad shechio with one grab. Whereas a larger animal, obviously, you could. Ve'edach ve'biber gadol inami kolechadika uksi. Whenever there are corners, whenever there are corners, that's when the animal can escape into the corners. Biber gadol, that's called a biber gadol. Uksi biber gadol. Ve'edach biber gadol. Inami, the third tarot says the Gemara tula de kuzla adadi, when the shadow of one wall falls on the other wall, is biber gadol, vidach biber gadol, the other one's biber gadol. Just to point out that one very important detail in halach lamaisa when it comes to trapping is whether you can get something b'chad shechi or not with one grab or not is going to determine whether it's going to be a daraisa or whether it's going to be a darabanan. And the classical case will be a mouse. If you have a mouse inside a house, you cannot get it b'chad shechi. Obviously, you cannot just grab the mouse, which obviously makes it much more difficult, and it's a much more of a higher level of trapping because it's not called trapped. Again, in this last time we'll point this out, that any time it's considered trapped, then it's worse because then you cannot trap from it. If it's not considered trapped, whenever it's considered trapped, it's better because then you could trap from it. If you have a teeny little box and the mouse is already in the box, by taking the box and grabbing it with your hand, you didn't do anything. Whereas if it's in a room, of course you did. Says the Gemara, 2 lines on the wide lines, look local shavin. Not all these enclosures equal. Amarav Yisrael, Amarav Yudam, Shmuel, Halacha. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, we pass like Shimon Gamliel. It sounds like you argue by pointing out that we pass like him. What's the difference? I told you that's how we pass him. Why do you care if someone argues or not? Classical teretz Gemara Zamarta Ta. You want the Gemara to be like a Zamarta, like a song. I want to know the exact way of doing it. Why are you telling me not? Says the Gemara, say to anything lacking in trapping. Says the Gemara, 3 lines into a wide line. What does that mean? It's lacking in trapping. Whenever you say let's get a trap, that means the animal's not trapped. If the mouse is on a mouse trap, you don't say get a mouse trap, it's already trapped. Or if the mouse is running loose, you say get a mouse trap. So at some time you say let's go get a trap, that means it's lacking in trapping and you're not allowed to trap it on Yantar. What do you mean, says Abaya? But when it comes to geese, when it comes to chickens, where people say, let's get a trap to trap it. And yet, we learned in a Beitzah of Itanya, there's no Isidderaisa from trapping them because they're already called trapped. So your rule doesn't work. One comes back to the coop in the evening, one does not, and therefore one is more trapped than the other. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? We got these dove coats that come to the attic. The Arab, they do come back home. And let's get rid of that highlight one more time. If you trap any of these type of birds, the beer is chayiv. So why are you telling me the difference is whether they come back home or not? That makes them more trapped because you know it's going to come back. We see clearly in this price, even though these birds come back, it's still called chayiv. It's still a problem. Two qualifications. Number one, they come back home. Number two, their food is upon you. That is teretz number one into whether you're going to be allowed to trap. Well, it's not so simple of let's go get a trap, but rather more qualifying that it has to come home and has your food upon it. Then it's called already trapped, which of course everyone can understand because the animal is always going to come home. It's going to be easier to trap, and it's not such a problem. One slips away, one doesn't slip away. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Every animal slips away. What do you mean if it slips away or not? It always slips away from you. Says the Gemara, no, it means even from their coop, and therefore that's why it's not trapped, because the geese, even from their own coop, have a tendency to slip out. And that is the fascinating sugya of when you let a trap an animal. Of course, our Gemara was discussing trapping the animal on Yontif in order to eat it on Yontif, but of course the first cousin, like we pointed out, is trapping animals and insects, etc. on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah on the bottom of Chavdalid Amid Aleph. You made a trap for a bird, a trap for a wild animal, a trap for a fish, an Erev Yontif. Lo yital me'am b'yantif. You're not allowed to take, if it traps something on yantif, you can't take it on yantif. Elo imkin yodesh and it's in the Erev yantif, unless you know it was already trapped from before yantif. Of course, this is similar to that which we saw in the very, very beginning of this whole Masechta, saying that is noilad, something that comes into your possession on yantif, it's going to be moksa. Continues the Mishnah, Ma'isa benachri echad, the story with one guy. Shev, you died there of Gamliel, he brought fish to Rav Gamliel, v'amar mutar, and Rav Gamliel said they're allowed. I do not want to accept those fish. Says the Gemara, asking the obvious question we just said a moment ago, the only time you're allowed to eat the stuff is if you know it was trapped in Erev Yantif. Then it says, the story of the Rav Gamliel, they brought him fish. Sounds like fish that was trapped today on Yantif. And Rav Gamliel says it's mutter. What do you mean it's mutter? You just told me a second ago it's only mutter, it's from Erev Yantif. Ask the Gemara, Meiser Lister, you bring me a story to contradict that which you just said. Explains the Gemara, no, you're missing some critical words. Safek muchan aser, if you're not sure something was trapped, says the Tanakh, it's forbidden. Rav Gamliel matir, Rav Gamliel allows that. Oh my senami benachriach shevi dagan Rav Gamliel va'amar mutar and enel shenrotzad l'kabel emanu. So in the case of a suffix, if you know for sure it's a problem, but in the case of a suffix, that is the chiddush Rav Gamliel says. If you're not sure, it is allowed, and that's the story where he paskin that these fish from the guy was allowed to be eaten. He just didn't want to take them. Amar Rav Yudam Rashmuel ein alach Gamliel. We do not paskin like Rav Gamliel, rather if it's a suffix, it is forbidden. There are those who learned the following on a Beitzah. Suffix muchram, you're not sure if it was prepared before Yontif or not. Rav Gamliel matir, Rav Yeshua iser. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Rav Yeshua, we pass like Rav Yeshua. V'ikedim asla Titania. And some learned the following, turning over to Chav Dalet Amid Beis Sheichte min hanigrarim be Yontif. You're allowed to shacht from that which was taken from an enclosure on Yantiv, Avalom in our shoe size, but not something that was taken from a net, uminam kamayrais, or something from a trap. So if it was already in the enclosure, yes, but not from the trap. Rav Shimon Elazar Aimer Bo Maitan Mikul Kolamer of Yantiv. If you came and you found the trap was already messed up in Erev Yantiv, meaning already seems like an animal tampered with this trap. You know, Shem Erev Yantiv Nitzaida, it obviously trapped in Erev Yantiv as you saw the trap messed up. Umutarning allowed to use those animals. Beyond, if you found it on Yantiv itself messed up, you do it should be Yantiv Nitzaidai. You know that on Yantiv itself it got trapped Asurin, and it's going to be forbidden. So we just segued slightly, it's just a different application of that which we were just talking about. That we have a net, we have a trap, and we see that it's a little bit played with an Erev Yantif. Does that show that the animal was obviously trapped in Erev Yantif or not? That is the discussion over here. But the Gemara points out that Gufa Kasha, where Chavdalim and base 5 lines on the top, 6 lines on the top. Amrit, you taught me Ubamatz and Mekukam Erev Yantif. When you find it messed up in Erev Yantif, Biyadaya, you know, Shemi Erev Yantif needs Saidai, who's trapped in Erev Yantif. Taima, the classical question. It sounds like only if you see that it was messed up, that's when you assume that's a din. Fake if you don't know. Asurin. Sounds like stuff fake. Forbidden. Yeah, what is the seva? If you found it messed up on Yantif, you know, should be Yantif needs Saidai. If it was trapped in Yantif, Taimo, what's obvious implication? You see it messed up. So we have a contradiction, the classical stira in the Yukais. The contradiction in implications. One implication is that the suffix is okay, the other implication that the suffix is not okay. Answers the Gemara, but this is a way that you have to read the Beitzah. If you found it, ruined an Erev Yantiv, you know, it must be who's trapped in Erev Yantiv. Umutar, and then it's allowed. Hasfeika, but if you're not sure, Nasekemi, this is the part that we read in, you make it as if. Shadi said to be Yantiv, something that you're not sure, it's as if it was Vade on Yantiv itself. Vasurin, and then it's going to be forbidden. Very similar to the first lashon, just another way of bringing out the same point. What is the status of a suffix Says the Gemara that if it's a suffix, you make it as if it came on Yontif itself, and it's going to be forbidden. Bringing out this din of suffix muchan, it is forbidden. Says the Gemara, what was the final story in the Mishnah? They brought this fish in front of Rav Gamliel. The fish from a guy. Said Rav Gamliel, it's allowed. I just don't want it from the guy. Says the Gemara of Amr Mutar in Eid, Mutar in the Mai. What does it mean that these fish are mutar? Rav Amar Mutar the Kabel. You let to accept them, you let to touch them, you let to move them. Are you allowed to eat the fish, or you just let him move the fish? That's the machlekes Rav and Levi. Amar Rav explains Rav Leilam lo al yimna'atz when you Beitzah medrash. Says Rav, you should never leave Beitzah medrash early, never miss a shiur. Why? Afilu shachas, even one time. Myself and Levi learned in front of Rebbe. When he said this din, when he said in the night time, that you're allowed to eat the fish, but B'tzafra says, Rav Levi, you missed the shear. In the morning, you know what happened. Amar mutar and lekabel. You're only allowed to accept them, you're allowed to use them, you're not allowed to actually eat them. And Rav explains, I knew that the Rebbe himself was chayzer. Now since you can't eat, you can just move it. Levi did not know the halacha. So Rav says, you see how important it is to show up every single day to shear. If you miss one shear, you can miss everything. Says the Gemara. Now first we disprove the Levi from Rav himself pointing out that the Rebbe Levi was chayzer. Now the Gemara has a question on Levi. Levi that says they're allowed to even eat these fish that were brought by the guy. Meisvei asked the Gemara about 10 lines to the bottom. First one line is Nachri. Nachri Shavidar and Yisrael brings a gift to a Jew. Afilu dagin amepulin upeiris b'nei yaiman. Even if he brings moist fish or fruit that was picked that day, mutarim, you're allowed to eat it. So now what's the implication of this Beitzah? What does the word mutarim mean? If it means you can accept these fruit, you can accept these fish, I understand. Fruit that was picked on Yontif, does anyone say you can eat it? Of course not. So it says the Gemara, clear proof, not like Levi. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Who says you can move it either? It's Concise nylon. So what's your proof? Ella explains the Gemara, what must the case be? We're talking about fish that are red or fruits that are wrapped in greens. I mean, they're not really picked on that day. It just means they're very, very fresh. It's all a metaphor. And that's the reason why. And therefore, we have no proof you can move them, you can even eat them. So why are we calling them that they're from that day? They're not really from that day. They're similar to ones from that day. They're as fresh as our fruit from that day. Amar Papa, concluding today's daf, Hilchos Anachrish Havidaran Li Yisrael B'Yamtiv. If the same item are still on the tree, then you're not allowed to eat it. And even after Yontif, it's going to be asur. How long? The all-important rule that when malach is performed on behalf of a yid on Yontif and Shabbos, not only is it forbidden, it's forbidden after Yontif, the amount of time that it would take to get this item. So if it would take you 20 minutes, you have to wait 20 minutes after Yontif, kenas, and not eat the item. But let's say this item is not on the tree at all. If it came from within the chum, then it's allowed, because we see that no other malacha must have been done of this fruit from the fact that none of it is on the tree. Let's just turn over for one moment to Chafei Amal of tomorrow's daf and finish up. Chutz l'chum is aser, but if it's from outside the chum, it's going to be forbidden. A very important rule that the only time it is forbidden is for the Jew who is brought on behalf, but for another Jew, it's always going to be mutter. We'll pick up from here, Mirz Hashem, tomorrow.